If you like our podcast, we think you'll love our Next Economy MBA. It's a 9-month learning journey for entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, and aspiring change makers alike. Our MBA gives emerging leaders a new set of blueprints for creating life-serving, regenerative organizations. We explore topics like regenerative finance, cooperative models of ownership, alternative economics, and much more. You'll leave inspired by the stories of leading Next Economy organizations, and you'll be nourished by a community of mission-aligned peers. So we invite you to join our flourishing community of more than 275 alumni and growing. Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to learn more. That's lifteconomy.com/MBA to learn more. Cohort 7, our newest cohort, begins on September 21st, 2021. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Courtney Martin. Courtney's the author of 4 books and a popular newsletter, which I just subscribed to, called Examined Family. She's also a co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, Fresh Speakers, and the Bay Area chapter of Integrated Schools, as well as the storyteller in residence at the holding company. She says her literal happy place is her co-housing community in Oakland, California, and her metaphorical happy place is asking people questions. Courtney is also the author of the new book, which I just finished and highly recommend, called Learning in Public: Lessons for a Racially Divided America from My Daughter's School. Courtney, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
So Courtney, how did you first get into the work you're doing today?
Well, in some ways, my mind just, flashes back to my bedroom in, second grade with my parents gave me our very first computer. I think I got the hand-me-down once they upgraded. So there was this giant glowing green screen with the cursor in my room, and I would write short stories, which is all to say I've always been a writer and a reader. That's always been my home. So to become a writer and a reader made perfect sense for me, very organic. But this particular sort of strange medley of stuff I do now kind of grew out of both freelance writing career, which I started as soon as I graduated college. I was living in New York in the aughts, and I, pitched places and, became a freelance journalist, but also meanwhile was really interested in activism and kind of the nonprofit sector. And so I ended up doing a lot of consulting work around kind of storytelling within organizations, which led me to philanthropy and consulting for TED for a while and just doing a whole strange, interesting mix of things. But the central kind of narrative of all of it is about storytelling. I'm, a big believer in the profound effect that good stories can have and the social change that they can create.
Awesome. And where did this journey of sort of white identity and racial justice and school integration, when did that sort of really start to, when did you really start to grapple with some of that?
That's another one that on the one hand, it feels like a very recent evolution in certain ways. But then, when I look back at some of the things I wrote about in my high school newspaper, or even sort of the questions I was asking as a little girl, I realized a lot of them had a racial thread to them, but that I didn't really have the language for that. And the people around me didn't really know how to kind of nurture that instinct in me. So I do think I've always been someone who's very sensitive to inequality and noticing it and asking sort of systemic and cultural questions about it. But when I went to college, I grew up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and then I went to Barnard College in New York City. And at Barnard, I really started to think a lot about, I was a political science and sociology double major, and I was thinking a lot about racial injustice. I ended up studying abroad in South Africa. And at the time, sort of where I was in my racial development, I thought that's the place where I'm going to study apartheid and study racism. And then got there and of course had the very typical study abroad kid thing where I was oh, America is the place to study all of these things. Not that South Africa isn't, but just, these questions that were bubbling up were actually quite relevant to American sort of contemporary politics. So I've just always been kind of following that thread in various ways. And more recently, just become obsessed with schools in particular, in part because I have this like deep conviction that schools are the best public institution we have for strengthening democracy. And having just lived through such a fragile moment in our democracy, I'm like doubling down on my enthusiasm for them and, my very sober heartbreak about the state that they're in. So that led me to this book, which was really to think about sort of my personal moral journey around all of that hopefully in the context of these bigger systemic and structural questions.
I love it. And can you give folks just maybe what is the narrative that you tell in the book, and like what are some of the thorny issues that you start to grapple with, so folks who haven't read it can get a sense of what you write about?
Yeah. So I live not so far from Ryan, but in Oakland, California. And I live in what many think of as a gentrifying neighborhood. It was Italian quite a ways back. It was a Black neighborhood more recently. And now it's kind of a multiracial neighborhood. And I moved here from Brooklyn when I was pregnant with my first daughter, Maya. So that was about 8 years ago. And I started just, walking around the neighborhood as one does when they have a baby strapped to them and they're trying to stay sane. And I ended up realizing that there was this elementary school a few blocks from our house that just seemed like boisterous and lovely and, just really beautiful. But I started to notice that there were very few white kids on the playground, which didn't match up with the demographics of the neighborhood. And that, as I, say in the book, led to a journey of 1,000 moral miles, because I was asking sort of like, where are the white kids? And the truth is that white families in Oakland, by and large, strategize their way into very few public elementary schools, or of course, opt for private schools. Oakland is about 40% white and only 10% of the public school kids are white. So you already have this big attrition into private schools. And then those that stay in the public schools tend to go to just a few schools in our neighborhood, all of which I pretty immediately heard from sort of the whisper network on the playgrounds and birthday parties. Like, these are the schools you need to get into. And they were not the school that was in our neighborhood. So that led me to sort of put my journalist hat on and ask, why is this happening? And sort of what's the larger impact of these seemingly individual choices that white families and privileged families are making? And we decided to send our kid Maya to the Black majority Title I, 1 out of 10 on greatschools.org school in our neighborhood, despite that being different from what most of our peers and neighbors were doing. And so the book is really about making that choice, but then living into it. And I'm trying to ask a lot of questions in the book about the, possibilities and pitfalls of integration, that it's not, this perfect rainbow, melting pot of perfection that I think sometimes people who are sort of romantics about integration make it out to be. It's sometimes uncomfortable, and all those power dynamics that exist outside the school also exist inside the school. And so trying to show up as a white person with economic privilege in that setting, and where 75% of kids are on free and reduced lunch, it has not been simple at all. But it's also been just completely joyful and surprising and wonderful in so many ways. So the book is the story of that journey. And
you describe this in the book, but for folks who maybe think don't we have integrated schools? And can you just give that sort of a background? Everyone knows, I think everyone knows Brown versus Board of Education, but then so that's the law, but what's the de facto reality of our schools today?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. And I was one of these people too. I didn't even go to an integrated school, but somehow I thought schools were integrated, which I think is such a funny cognitive dissonance that so many of us have. It's we don't have evidence of integrated schools anywhere around us. And yet our story about American schools, many of us, is that they're integrated. Anyway, they aren't. The peak of integration in America was in 1988 when, probably you and I were little kids running around, right? So, and it's only gotten worse since then. And I think this is one of those cases where we have just a little bit of knowledge in a dangerous way. So people know about Brown v. Board, 1954, and they have that picture of Ruby Bridges marching up the stairs bravely with, U.S. Marshals near her. So we think, it happened. But really, the policy was way ahead of the culture. So as soon as Brown v. Board was passed, people in both the South and the North and, everywhere, created really strong movements called massive resistance. That's sort of the name of the pushback to Brown v. Board, to make sure that it was weakened at every turn. So, through the courts, but also culturally. And one of the things I got the most sort of inspiration from was this book called Mothers of Mass Resistance by this historian, Elizabeth McCrae Gillespie, where she sort of documented the way in which white, we think of these things as like big, bad white guy judges who, chipped away at Brown v. Board. And there were certainly many of those guys in the picture. But a lot of it was white mothers, just like me, who went to the birthday parties, went to the auxiliary clubs, went to wherever, and really spread the word that integration was dangerous and that there were all of these fears that parents should have, white mothers should have about it. And she calls that group of women the constant gardeners of segregation. And they were very effective, right? I mean, that's why integration has not been effective in this country. And so I started to think about, what does it look like to be a constant gardener of the opposite? What does it look like to be on the playground or in the birthday party and be the white mom who says, actually, I don't think we should talk about schools that we've never set foot on as good or bad. I think that we should visit them and see what they're like. And I actually think those numbers on greatschools.org are pretty limited. They're largely based on standardized tests, which we know map onto socioeconomics. So they tell us a lot about the income level of the families in a school, but they don't actually tell us that much about the teaching in that school. So just kind of doing this little constant sort of cultural disruption in my social world. And I think that that's, the book sort of sits at that praxis of like, I'm trying to describe some big political things and economic things because I think it's important for us to understand them. But it's, as you just experienced, it's very memoir driven. It's very personal. And that's because I feel like white people and white mothers in particular, white parents in particular, have to take this personally because we have historically done the undermining of integration, and Black families and Black kids and brown kids and brown families have had to do the really hard stuff, like being bused into communities that didn't really care for them, which, as a parent, any of us who stop long enough to think about what that would feel like for our kids has to have some empathy and have some sense of wanting to step into doing some of the hard stuff ourselves.
And so what's the benefits of integrated schools? Because I talked to people who have said, isn't it up for debate whether integrating schools works? We don't want white families coming in and taking over. And so I think there's still a lot of confusion about the benefits and how it can be done, quote unquote, right.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. And I like the idea of approaching it by saying, who are we centering when we think about who it's benefiting? So if, for example, we say, does integration benefit Black and brown kids, those who have been historically most marginalized in this country, those who are economically disadvantaged? The answer is pretty convincingly yes. Rucker C. Johnson, who's this professor at Berkeley, has an amazing book called Children of the Dream that summarizes his research, which is the most, the largest scale and longest scale of data that he synthesized. And he says the medicine that is integration works, that Black and brown kids, the earlier they're in integrated schools and the longer they're in integrated schools, do better on all of sort of the academic metrics. So, score better on tests, more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go into college, more likely to stay into college, but also these lifelong factors like more likely to earn more over a lifetime, healthier, less cardiovascular disease, and all these wild things that you would not associate with, going to an integrated kindergarten, right? And white kids, according to the same research, do fine as compared to their peers on all these metrics and actually have this set of sort of emotional skills that kids who grew up in really homogenous environments just obviously wouldn't have. So the data is there. For Black and brown kids, it's a benefit. And for white kids, actually, it's a benefit too. That doesn't describe sort of the spiritual or emotional effects of integration, which I think are important to think a lot about. And I tried to sort of wrestle with in the book, which to your point of if I'm a white mom and I show up and try to remake the school according to my values, that could be incredibly damaging to Black and brown families who've been in that school for a long time. If I'm a white mom who shows up and kind of sits around and listens for a while and tries to figure out how to plug in my resources, which is part of why I'm there, and does it, good faith effort to do it humbly and in the service of everybody's collective vision of what that school should be, that's probably going to cause a lot less harm. So it's not a science. It's, as humans are, it's always an art. But that's part of what I was trying to do in the book, is like describe the art and all of my like fumbling attempts at getting it right in order to, let people try that on, let parents who are thinking about this kind of live into the experience a little bit through my own and maybe make a different kind of decision than they might otherwise.
And have you found, there's a lot of great anecdotal stories at Emerson. I'm curious, like a year on, like what else are you seeing with like your daughter Maya and like maybe some of the other kids? One thing that stood out to me too, that just is like a benefit that maybe white parents don't realize that you point out in the book is, like during COVID, you talked about like the inherent resiliency of the community because of, many Black and brown families are dealing with crises constantly. And so a COVID pandemic bringing together that community, there was like already some like layers of resiliency and community bonds built in to like, oh yeah, now we're handing out food to families that need it. And it was just like rapid that some of the like richer, whiter schools were suddenly like, we've never experienced this before.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
totally.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, I had friends whose kids were at more highly resourced schools who were really frustrated because they felt like their principals had sort of been caught flat-footed during COVID and were kind of like, okay, let's not do anything. Don't learn anything new for a while because we got to sort of get our bearings. And my experience of Emerson and both the principal and the teachers was just that they like sort of hit the ground running, like, okay, who needs food? Who needs a Chromebook? Who needs a hotspot? They were driving like all day long around Oakland, getting people what they needed. I was just so impressed. And then it occurred to me, like, that's not so unlike what happens any day at Emerson, where it's like, oh, someone slept in their car last night. What do we need to do to make sure that kid can show up for school today? Or, someone's mom is dealing with addiction and we need to like make sure this kid gets some extra love and TLC this week. So I think there's a way in which the school already had its muscles as kind of a social service agency. And then the more white, more highly resourced schools where families, for the most part, probably privatize those kinds of problems. It's not that there isn't addiction. They're probably not sleeping in their cars, but, there's addiction and there's problems in white families. But those problems, I think, tend to be privatized. You buy, you go to the rehab center, you buy the mental health services you need, as opposed to relying on the school or relying on community or others and having that sort of shared interdependence. So that was a really beautiful thing to observe and experience. And I think it's still going on. We're back in person and we've already had COVID cases at the school and it's confusing and scary in various ways. But there is this real sense of everyone kind of like trying to be together in it and make sure that kids are wearing their masks. And, it's like, I haven't seen a community of people being so diligent about wearing masks as I have this multiracial, multi-class community of parents who are dropping kids off. And this is also grandparents and aunties and uncles. And so we know how to show up for each other. And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
And I think there's this larger piece. So there's both like the personal and maybe community benefits, but you also point to this like public schools as one of the last places that you can have like a cross-class, cross-racial sort of like proximity in many ways, because we live in such segregated places and, the workplaces are often not diverse. And you make this argument that like public schools are part of multiracial democracy building. Could you also speak to that piece, like why public schools are so critical to that?
Yeah, especially in this last, couple of years, as I said, like I've never been so sober about how fragile democracy is and how much we need shared institutions that help us have shared ideas about truth and science and history and all of these like profound paradigms that basically we're all standing on top of as we, share this country. And if our public schools aren't strong places where people can come together and wrestle with all these things, the meaning of history, how reliable is science? What do we trust about the scientific process? What do we not? These questions that we see coming up in our headlines, that I think we sort of doom future generations, because that to me is like where the baseline, sort of the foundation of all of this stuff first starts. And, perhaps someone smarter than me could make a really good reverse argument that some of what we're seeing right now is the result of unequal school education and, so many people not getting critical thinking skills and not getting some of the social emotional capacities to like come together with people unlike them, et cetera. So that's like on the political level. I just feel like, one of the questions that comes up around this book is so many people say everybody wants what's best for their kids. So of course you'd send your kid to the most highly resourced school possible, the one with the innovation lab and the, art teacher 5 days a week and the drone access and the guitar lessons and all the things. And from my perspective, that is either a short-term question or a long-term question. For the long term, I'm 100% convinced that going to integrated schools is the best thing for all of our kids because it means they will have a democracy in which people know how to like live together and work together and have shared understandings about things. And on a short-term basis, I'm pretty convinced it's the best thing for my kid too, or at least a great thing. I don't know if I even care if it's a best thing, as if there's sort of like a ladder of hierarchies, but like it's a great thing. Like both of my girls now are at the same school and they're both like totally joyful and happy and learning and interested. So it seems pretty great. So like that's, for me, it's kind of like the best thing for our democracy is for there to be strong integrated public schools. And I really mean that in a future sense. The best thing for the democracy of 50 years from now, 40 years from now, when our 4 kids are adults, is for that to be the case.
What are the top 3 or like top couple resistant, like you've heard all the, like you give tours to white parents and you talk to them about Emerson or, what are you hearing as like the top reasons white families don't go to an integrated school? And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to the reasons folks like maybe naturally don't feel compelled to do that. And then what are sort of like the counterpoints?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious, what are some of the top reasons you hear of people not wanting to go to an integrated school?
Well, it's interesting because I'm in such a progressive enclave. People aren't that direct about not wanting to go. So it's kind of like not a point counterpoint. It's like more of sort of this like evasive, like we want to go, but we, like there's a lot of sort of like excuses, or other people might argue not excuses, but what sometimes sound to be like excuses. But there's also like very clear language that I hear, not just locally, but all over the country. So people see a school with majority Black and brown kids and they say, oh, it seemed chaotic. It seemed maybe rough. Those are kind of these code words we now use instead of more racist language because we don't want to identify as racist. So we have these other ways of saying it. I've heard a lot of the clause, it's not a good fit for our kid, which is sort of also this like vague, I can't really create a counterpoint because it's like, I don't even know what that really means. A lot of talk about how sensitive people's kids are. They have like particular needs that they have to have met and that the school can't meet those needs, which is something I wrestle with in the book because I kind of realize in retrospect how sensitive my older child is and start to think like, wait, am I just like an insensitive parent that I didn't like more heavily consider this? But I actually think, there are some kids who are profoundly sensitive and have particular needs they need adults to meet. But I think there's also this huge proportion of white and privileged kids whose parents see their sensitivities and kind of rally around them and codify them and get like really invested in creating like these controlled, perfect environments for their kids rather than trying to kind of ride the wave and say, all right, like, let's see how the kid can cope. And the developing those coping mechanisms for kids who can develop them is a really strengthening sort of confidence building thing to do. So there's a lot about sensitivity of white kids. I'm trying to think. I feel like those are kind of the big, it's more evasive here. I don't know if in other places people would. It
seems you had said something around like, I have like political beliefs and then like my duty to my child.
Yeah, there's a lot of
those are different.
Don't experiment with your kid is one thing people have certainly said to me. Obviously getting those emails now that the book is out. And that one I just find just kind of preposterous because for me, this whole, I don't know how you feel, you're a father, but like this whole parenting thing is like one big frickin' experiment, like, and maybe this is because John and I don't do enough reading parenting literature, but for us, it's like this wild ride where we're kind of flying by the seat of the pants, learning who our kids are, trying to be, create this environment in which they can thrive and, just doing our best every day. And so I feel like I'm always running an experiment. So it didn't it didn't really bother me when people would say that. I have thought a lot about, and this is really important to me, is not turning my kids into some sort of political performance. And ultimately, that has been really interesting, especially in talking about the book as it's come out, because in a culture where there's so much anxiety about virtue signaling and so much anxiety about sort of like ally theater, and, you know, we have all these terms to check people for performance. I think one of the losses is that it makes people not actually want to do things that they think are right because they're afraid it will be seen in that way. So like in a culture where everyone's talking about virtue signaling, where's the place for virtue? Like, where's the place for actually being like, no, we believe in this. And so our kids are going to do this because we believe in it, not because we want to like trot them out as kids who are doing this thing because it's our politics. So that is a really interesting one that I think I've struggled with. I wonder how they will process it as they continue to grow and mature. I mean, I hope our kids are like light years ahead of us on all of these things. And that's one of the conclusions in the book, is this is generational work, and like every generation's job is to push it forward a little bit further. So maybe Maya and Stella will be like, Mom, virtue signaling, that's like so 2021, like that's ridiculous. But right now it feels like one of my concerns is just making sure they don't feel, you know, like part of some performance.
The highly sensitive thing is, I wanted to ask you about it because our older daughter is maybe very similar to yours, where it's like, you know, highly sensitive to noise and like taste, like only eats like white carb foods.
Oh my gosh. Our daughters should have a dinner party together where they just eat tortillas and bagels and like plain pasta. It'll be disgusting.
With maybe butter.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I, we live in Marin, which is like super segregated, you know, the number one most economically segregated, like it's like the highest wealth and the lowest wealth. It's like the most racially disparate in the whole state. And it's really interesting because the sensitivity thing, we were like, you know, looking at these private schools, which we're both public, you know, the whole story of like, I'm a public school person, but like maybe I should try private school. And we just ended up saying like, we can't afford, you know, $25,000, $30,000 a year for, so we were sending it to the local school. And when I was reading your book, I was so happy, like, yes, we made this like really great decision, integrated schools. And then I looked on the diversity of the school. It's like less than 1% Black. You know, there is 14% Latinx and, you know, like, you know, 9% Asian, but still, you know, 70% white at the public school in our area. And so I'm curious, like, how do you see, is one of the things that you're advocating for public schools in general? And like, how do you see like majority white public schools? Is that still part of the solution? I mean, like,
yeah, I mean, yeah, so that's what you're, you know, coming up against is the ways in which even public schools are not truly public anymore for all kinds of reasons. But the biggest one being, if, you know, as Jack Schneider, who's this great thinker on this stuff, says, when you buy a house, you buy a school. So it's like, even if you're buying a public school, access to a public school, that was something that happened on the private market, right? And those who can afford to live in that neighborhood get to go to that school. So I'm guessing that's probably something around the dynamic that's happening with you guys. And then you also have this effect, which is the PTA private fundraising at various schools. So whereas, you know, Emerson, the school my kids go to, on our big annual fundraiser night of the year, you know, make at the most between like $10,000 and $20,000, probably closer to 10. The public school, you know, however many miles away, that's whiter and more highly resourced, is going to make at least 10 times that in a night. So that those dollars have such profound impacts on schools, right? That is the difference between, you know, at Emerson, we have a librarian 4 days a week and we fight like hell to keep her. At that school, I'm sure there's never any question that there's going to be a librarian 5 days a week. We don't have an independent art teacher. Our arts integration is through the teachers in the classroom, the regular classroom teachers. I'm sure this other school has a full-time art teacher. So, and that matters. It matters for kids, all these things. So there are all of these ways in which the supposed sanctity of like a public institution is actually not that public when this, you know, comes down. I don't think it's to say that someone like you investing in a public school is for naught. Like, it's still, I think, writ large, if we can continue to nurture and feed our public schools and also keep white kids in public schools. I mean, one of the things that happens in districts where there's so much white flight from public schools is that districts will cater to whatever white families want to try to like keep them in the public schools. So to stay in public schools, to do so humbly and without a lot of demands on the district, and maybe even more demands thinking about not your kid, but other people's kids, and sort of like when questions come up around public school policy in your district, thinking like, okay, let me think about how the most marginalized kids in Marin would experience these things. And can I talk to their parents and see what are they organizing around, and like, how can I be useful? There's so many opportunities, I think, for white parents in even highly white public schools to be allies and show up for parents of color who are organizing. So yeah, that's where I come down. And it's not that I think private schools are like some sort of, scarlet letter that like, if you send your kid to a private school, you're evil. But I do feel very strongly about telling the truth about sending your kid to private schools means you have disinvested in a public system. And what do you think about that? Like, how do you square that? And what can you do to make sure that these public institutions where the rest of the city's kids are dwelling are places that are like enlivening and dignified and all the things, as opposed to just choosing a private solution for your kids and kind of looking away from the reality of public schools in your city?
I think white parents are pretty good at making that cognitive dissonance, right? We're like, we will separate it out. It's funny about my child's school district. When we moved here, it was called Dixie School District. You probably heard about
yeah.
The whole like national battle. And so we were pumped to get it renamed to Miller Creek. And but yeah, it's, Marin definitely has a lot of challenges with segregation. Obviously, there's like the Canal District, majority Latinx, and then Marin City. Tupac famously lived there for a little bit.
Do you still have, or when I was doing some reporting for the book, you did have a really radical superintendent. Is that guy still in office?
Maybe it depends on which city or like district.
Okay. I remember hearing him speak at something and I was just like totally blown away. Maybe he was more in the Sausalito area.
That's probably what it was.
I should send you there. There was also a radio piece on some of what he was trying to do. And the bigger takeaway here is like, anytime this particular superintendent I'm thinking of was trying to change policy on a fundamental level so that the schools would be more integrated, giving white families and privileged families less choice, and also making zip code matter less. So this sort of weakening this edict of if you buy a house, you buy a school. Anytime superintendents do that, white parents go completely crazy, right? So it's a very challenging thing to do politically, and a lot of people continue to try. There's also like more subtle versions, obviously. Berkeley is an example of a school regionally, or a school district, that regionally that does a much better job of creating more integrated schools because of the way that they basically like cut the lines in Berkeley for what kinds of schools you go to. It's much less economically and racially segregated than Oakland. So there are a lot of folks in Oakland who are organizing around that and saying, like, let's shift our actual enrollment policy and make it as like white parent proof as possible, which is tricky and very political to do. And I think that's what actually this guy in your own backyard was trying to do at some point. So I've actually meant to follow up and see if he's still in office, because that's, it can be kind of political suicide for superintendents to try to push back against white parents.
Yes. Because I know Sausalito, for example, had an actual case brought by the Justice Department for literally having segregated schools.
Yeah.
So,
and again, all this is in 2021. Like, I just want to emphasize, this is 2021, the summer of racial reckoning. So many has passed. So many of us who are, white families, privileged families, Asian American families have felt genuine, deep, earnest desire to be part of a different kind of America, to heal some of the racial history that we are like really waking up to. And so for me, that's, on the one hand, sort of like my cynical side can just be so upset about the hypocrisy of us feeling that way and yet continuing to like be totally comfortable with and complicit in segregated schools. On the other hand, it's this huge opportunity. And this is what our friend Garrett Bucks would say, is like, there is such goodness in the hearts of white and or privileged people who actually do want to do things differently. But it can seem very daunting to think like, okay, I did the book club. I like went to the protest. I'm like trying to do the things. And I'm not sure I'm really fundamentally changing anything. Like, I don't know that my impact is that profound. I have found that being part of this multiracial, multi-class public school feels very edifying. It feels very like, it's not all my work racially that I need to do, but it's a way to like just be in real solidarity and community and kind of be living the questions instead of being in my own little bubble of angst and sadness about the state of our country. So I think the Buxian, I'll give him a special title. The Buxian, Garrett Bucks is an amazing writer and thinker and organizer on anti-racist white issues. So you all should look him up. And he's a mutual friend of Ryan and mine. I feel like the Buxian question is sort of like, how do we take that kernel of true, earnest desire to be a part of a less racist America and, grow it and grow it and grow it and nurture it. So that's, I hope, what this book does in some way.
One of the stories you told in the book was about a merger between Kiser Elementary and Sankofa, and now they are merged. I'm curious, I did speak to somebody recently who I think had a kid at Kiser, and I was like, oh, I'm talking to a woman who's writing about it. She's like, yeah, I've heard it's a disaster. And I was like, it's probably white parents who think it's a disaster. I'm curious for like what Courtney is going to say.
Oh, that's fascinating. Did her kid go to, I'm guessing her kid doesn't go to Sankofa United then?
I don't know. It was like a friend of a friend type thing.
Oh, that's very interesting.
But I'm curious to hear what's the take on the merger.
Well, so just for background.
And the backstory, yeah.
Kiser was a school in the Oakland Hills, which has historically been a more privileged enclave. And Sankofa was a historically majority Black school in the flatlands, so lower income Black and brown majority. And the school district has been trying to merge and close schools over the last few years. There was a big small school movement in previous decades. And so we have this problem now in this district, which is like way too many schools and not enough money to go around. And so the district has been trying to figure out how to kind of backtrack, get the toothpaste back in the tube, as it were, which is not an easy thing to do. So one of the things they figured out was merge these two schools, which many of the families who actually had enrolled their kids in the school in the hills lived in the district of the Flatland school. So it was actually closer to them to go to that school. The school in the hills was whiter and performing much better on most academic metrics. So the district proposed to merge them. All hell broke loose, as you can imagine, in great generalizations, just because, we don't have time to get into all the nuances. White families really pushed back against the merger. Black families who went to Sankofa said, please come, we welcome you. And the merger went through, to a lot of people's shock. And because it was against the white parents' wishes, which, as I said, is often what shapes district policy. So this new school is called Sankofa United. It's in the Flatland site where Sankofa historically was. I think it's about a quarter of the kids from Kiser are at Sankofa United. So ultimately only a quarter of the kids went there. And I think they have all of the growing pains of any merged community, particularly one that merged during a COVID year. So their first year together was all online. Now they're physically together. But I've actually heard fantastic things about the ways in which particularly the parent community came together. I mean, they really organized barbecues together and tried to say, okay, politics was politics. That was really damaging and harmful. The school board meetings where everyone's shouting at each other. Let's share food, share playtime for our kids. Let's come together as a community. So I've been very moved by what the Kiser families who chose to go to the school and the school itself, particularly moved by the Sankofa parents who I can imagine being incredibly turned off and offended by some of what they heard, that those parent communities have really merged and come together. And they're, the principal and the teaching staff is creating more cohesion. And, it's a really hard thing to do, I think, to merge two schools, but particularly in the wake of that kind of vitriol. And so I've actually been quite impressed. On the other hand, I think so many Kiser families got themselves into the most white, most highly resourced schools. The irony of which is that at the school board meetings, they were all screaming, we love diversity. We are a diverse school. Don't shut us down. And then they send their kids to the least diverse schools in the district. So it's a little all right, how real was all of that talk at the school board meetings? But anyone who's been to a school board meeting knows they are disasters, which is another thing I've gotten really interested in. I'm a solutions journalist by like instinct and training. And so I really want to spend some time researching like school board structure and meetings and like who could do it better such that we would actually have like more democratic and respectful, dignifying processes at the district level. So that's my next project.
Oh, wow. That's like super nerdy, but like super useful.
So nerdy. Yeah, I am really
like
nerdy.
No one else is going to do it, so you got to do it.
I'm really nerdy, and I have the privilege of being a freelancer. So like that's the kind of question that it's like a root cause question that most education journalists don't get to ask because they're just like covering the school board meeting. And so they don't get to be like, wait, why the hell do we run school board meetings this way? So I feel lucky to get to kind of follow my nose on some of those things. I mean, it won't be a book length inquiry. It will be an article, but it's nice to have the book, out in the world so that I can pick up some of the threads that I didn't really get to dig in on as much as I wanted to and produce some short form stuff out of it.
So if you're a parent who's listening and you're excited by this topic, you're interested in sending your kid to an integrated school, maybe you'd already thought about it, maybe you haven't thought about it till now. What are some steps or what should people be thinking about or looking for when they're like thinking about this decision?
I think, first of all, go to Integrated Schools, which is a national organization that I have just gained so much from. It was started by this amazing woman, Courtney McKitten, who tragically passed away in the course of me writing the book. And so that's a piece of the narrative as well. But it's basically this national movement of white and our privileged parents who are choosing integrated schools and then sort of showing up for each other as we try to figure out how to do that most respectfully when we show up to the school. There's a podcast associated with the organization, which is really fantastic. And if you read the book, then you might want to listen to an episode they did with me where myself and one of the main characters in the book, Mrs. Minor, kind of hash out a bunch of things on air, which is really fun and interesting. So Integrated Schools, check it out. And I think the other thing is to just really make the effort to show up at schools now that, we're in this Delta variant. I'm not sure in what ways that's going to be possible this fall. I don't know. Are people going to have physical school tours? Is it going to be virtual? I don't know. But look at the schools that your friends aren't looking at. Don't just settle for the inherited spreadsheet that tells you like these are the only 3 schools that are worth going to. Oakland, as an example, has 81 schools in the district, and there's, like 3 that white families clamor to get into. So people have sometimes asked me, like, is this like an advertisement for Emerson? Are you worried that you're like evangelizing and all these white people are going to show up? And I'm like, on the one hand, that does worry me. On the other hand, there are 81 schools. Like, this is not about Emerson. This is about like all the schools here in Oakland, but all the schools across the country that white and privileged people overlook because they don't have the numbers that they want when in fact they're like beautiful, interesting communities. And I think when you go on those tours to really ask yourself, like, what is a school? I think a school is a community first and foremost, especially an elementary school. It's an opportunity for your kid to have a social experience that teaches them how to like be a person in the world and community, that lights them up about, interesting subjects, learn about themselves and what they're passionate about. So don't ask yourself, like, does this school have, the exact right kind of like second language instruction or like innovation lab that my wildest dreams are made of? Ask yourself, like, is this a place where my kid is going to learn how to like live in multiracial, multi-class democracy where they will be lit up by learning and where they will feel like they belong and like learn what they're passionate about and feel like loved and seen? If that's the case, it's probably worth trying, no matter what the racial background of the kids on that playground are.
Yeah, and be wary of great schools because of the way that they calculate the score. And also like be wary of like parent forums where it's like basically white, anxious parents.
Yeah. And especially parents who like sent their kid to that school 10, 15 years ago. Because that's another thing I've really noticed is the reputation of a school seems to follow it like long after it's due. And so even contemporary opinions about the school may be totally false, but I can especially guarantee you that like 10-year-old opinions about the school are probably not worth listening to.
And who are, a couple more questions. Who are the Black and brown leaders that you're really looking to for inspiration around this topic of school integration? Or, Mrs. Minor is a great leader,
and
totally profiler in the book, but others. that come to mind?
My kid's transitionary kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Miner, who now has her own preschool in East Oakland, is definitely one of my people that I'm in dialogue with and just love learning from. I love Eve Ewing. If you've never read Eve Ewing, she has a book called Ghosts in the Schoolyard that's really beautiful about school closures. She's also a poet, so she has a lot of cool poetry. She is really fun to follow on Instagram if you're an Instagram person. Obviously, Nicole Hannah-Jones is like foundational to the work I do and to this field, who now is doing 1619 Project and like kind of has not written about education quite as much in recent years, but is certainly the one who sort of blazed the path for me in this inquiry. Rucker C. Johnson, I mentioned at Berkeley, has this book called Children of the Dream. If you're like a nerd like me and you want to actually see all the research, he writes about it, but it's actually a very palpable book. It's not super academic. So that's one I'd recommend. I loved Jack Schneider's Beyond Test Scores. He's a white guy, but I think he's doing some really important thinking about like how we measure schools. And then, I certainly gain a lot from people who aren't applying their ideas to education specifically, but have had a real impact on me, like Resmaa Menakem, who I think you've had on the show, whose book I read, and, just a lot of incredible, I'm an old feminist, so I've, relied so much on Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks and all these like incredible Black feminist thinkers over the years.
Cool. And one of the questions we like to one of the last few questions to wrap is, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners help you grow this next economy?
Wow. So nice. What do I need right now? I think just more white people to do the kind of work that you're doing, Ryan, with your group of white men who are gathering and trying to like understand and think about these issues. Barn Raisers Project, which was started by Garrett Bucks, who I mentioned earlier, who's doing free online organizing opportunities for white people, integrated schools. I think that the more that white folks can like really figure out how to both feel the deep feelings of what racism has, the sort of effects of it has had on this country and on our own souls, like the more that we can like stay with those feelings and really feel them, learn a lot, do the intellectual work of reading and all the rest of it, especially authors of color, and then move to action, move to collective action, which I think is where Garrett is especially good. I just think it could shift so much in this country. And so, just come along with us, come along with me and Ryan and Garrett and all the other people who are really trying to like ask these questions personally and politically and take some real action.
And where can folks find more about your work, like website and any information you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I got the website designed by my designer husband. It's very pretty. CourtneyEMartin.com. That's my middle initial, E. And I'm on Instagram at CourtWrites and Twitter at CourtWrites. And then I have, as you mentioned in the beginning, this Substack newsletter called Examined Family, which you can subscribe to for free, or you can do a paid subscription if that's something you have the capacity for. And I send out these weekly essays, usually on Wednesdays. And then I also do a Q&A on Fridays with some of the thinkers and organizers and activists I'm most excited about in the world. So you can check both of those out.
Yeah, don't forget to get the book, Learning in Public. Try not to get it at Amazon, but we won't judge you if you have to.
Although guess what Amazon just did? They made it so you can't write a review unless you bought it at Amazon. How screwed up is that?
Oh, wow.
I'm really not happy about that. But you can write a review at Goodreads. So I look forward to hearing what you all think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Courtney, thanks so much for being on the show. You don't have to drop right now. I'll just say an outro.
Yes.
And then, okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Courtney, thanks so much for being on the show. And we'll have to get you back on to talk about school board meetings and what you found. Let's like really get knee deep into it.
Get truly nerdy. Well, I can tell I found a fellow nerd if you make that suggestion. So thank you for being a nerd and thanks for doing the work and parenting so consciously yourself. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.